Welcome to Now and Then, a podcast from the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI. SEI is an international non-profit research and policy organization that tackles environment and development challenges. With 8 centers spread across 5 continents, we connect science and decision-making to develop solutions for a sustainable future for all. Discussions are centered around the 3 focus areas of our work: reduced climate risk, sustainable resource use and resilient ecosystems, and improved health and well-being. Guests include SEI staff, partners, policymakers, researchers, and others. This podcast will reflect on how the decisions made over the coming years will determine mankind's living conditions for decades ahead. My name is Andrea Lindblom, and I'm a Senior Communications Officer at SEI. In this episode, we want to talk loss and damage. Loss and damage is an umbrella term that's used in international climate negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. And it looks set to be the defining issue for the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, COP27. The real world, outside of negotiations, offers many examples of loss and damage, though that is then often referred to as losses and damages. And we'll get into the highly politicized nature of loss and damage versus losses and damages a bit later in this podcast. But basically, when an unbelievable heat wave, like the one that hit India and Pakistan earlier this year, combines with a drought that causes crops to fail and humans to struggle to find water, that's such a damage. Scientists say climate change made such a heat wave 30 times more likely, and people in India and Pakistan had not been able to adapt to what such a heat wave would bring with it. From mid-June to the end of August, it was again Pakistan that was hit, this time by record-breaking monsoon rainfall. Here, Sherry Rehman, Pakistani climate minister.
The volume and scale of water that's come down is so consistent and without gaps for 8 weeks that there's been nowhere to put the water when we, drain it out. Where do you put it? The south is just like one large ocean.
The rains and floods destroyed more than 1.5 million homes, thousands of kilometers of roads, more than 200 bridges, and more than 1,000 health facilities. In one way or another, this weather event affected more than 33 million people. Nearly 1,500 people lost their lives. While scientists from the World Weather Attribution Initiative found it impossible to quantify the exact extent to which climate change made this event more likely, they did arrive at the conclusion that climate change likely increased the monsoon rainfall. The latest scientific report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, says human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. But it's not just these sudden, intense, extreme weather events that make for losses and damages to nature and people. We also see loss and damage from the fact that a warming climate makes the sea level rise and coasts erode, or that it turns oceans sour, threatening animals and plants in the oceans that we, humans, in turn, depend on. The people that are at the forefront of this are the people that live in countries very exposed to climate change impacts, with little capacity and financial resources to adapt. People in least developed countries and small island states that have themselves emitted hardly any of the gases that have already warmed our atmosphere by 1.1 degrees compared to pre-industrial times.
1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees is a death sentence for the people of Antigua and Barbuda, for the people of the Maldives, for the people of Dominica and Fiji, for the people of Kenya and Mozambique, and yes, for the people of Samoa and Barbados. We do not want that dreaded death sentence.
That was Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of the Caribbean island country of Barbados, addressing the last UN climate change conference in Glasgow. Loss and damage is an issue that young people around the world are particularly engaged with. Young people like Paul Chukwuma. Paul is 23 years old and originally from Nigeria. He now lives and studies in Rwanda, the 10th most vulnerable country to climate change, according to an index compiled by the University of Notre Dame in the US. Paul joined the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition in Rwanda, and as part of the work in that coalition, he has talked to some 200 young people in rural parts of Rwanda. I asked Paul how these youths were vulnerable to climate change and losses and damages.
These youth, which are into agriculture over time, have developed a kind of understanding of when best to kind of have their plant their crops or to do harvest. But apparently, they are noticing a slight change in these patterns, which is in turn affecting the yields of the crop in the long run, but also when they plant and also when they harvest. And when we move from the narration of the youth, majority of which were into agriculture, on a broader landscape, residents in Rwanda that have experienced this climate change event, for example, in Mozambique and also in the western or eastern province in 2020, over 1,000 families were actually displaced, and we had an estimated loss of around $13 million. And so these losses and damages translates to different experiences for different people in Rwanda, depending on where they actually reside. And so for the farmers, most especially, this losses and damages, this climate change events translates to these experiences around how they harvest their crops, when they plant, and the rest of that. And also for residents as well, there has been forced migration, and also some families have actually lost their homes and properties during the incidents of such of this climate change event. So, for example, that would be one key reference would be the flooding in 2020 within the period of January to April. So these experiences kind of compiles in a way the different ways the residents in Rwanda have kind of experienced loss and damage.
Now, in the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition that you're active in, one of the objectives of this coalition is to build capacity of the global youth on this subject. Why is that important?
Putting into perspective loss and damage is super important because we need to take action now to address loss and damage, but it all starts with an acknowledgement of what the term is and an understanding of what loss and damage actually is, because that's when you really understand why it's important to advocate for it. So capacity of youths in regards to this is important for us to take action now, because without this, we can't really place demands that are feasible. We can't really communicate in a language that its decision makers can actually relate to, right? So it is quite important for the actions now that we build our capacities to really understand what loss and damage is and how we can effectively respond to it. But much more than that is that we need to be prepared as youths, right? Because we have youths aspiring more and more to be a part of the decision-making process, right? So if we who would actually be taking over, who would be kind of leading the decision-making front, 20, 30 years from now, we need to have a thorough or rooted understanding of what loss and damage is and why the concept is really relevant. Because that's when we get to that point, actions that we wouldn't have to go back again to the drawing board, but we'll be ready to maximize the opportunity that has been given to us as youth to really make decisions and drive humans and the planet into a peaceful coexistence.
When we talked before we did this recording, you said that loss and damage is the greatest injustice that we are facing as youth. How is that?
Right now, as youths, we are robbed of so much. Aside from being put aside, especially when it comes to the discussions and decision-making processes around this conversation, we are actually facing the impacts on the ground. Our future is at risk, and also we are threatened daily by the brute consequences of climate change, even though we have played very little role in contributing to it. So that's why I feel like it's a very significant injustice to youth.
Now, the UN Secretary General said recently that the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, must be the place for action on loss and damage. What is the action on loss and damage that you would like to see at COP27?
We want loss and damage finance now. That's what the youths are saying. Loss and damage finance now. Of course, the outcome of COP27 in terms of really tackling loss and damage are on two fronts: the finance for loss and damage and also the Santiago network on loss and damage. So on one end, it's institutionalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage, which of course would be the framework or the guide for providing technical support to developing countries in addressing loss and damage. That's on one end. But on the other end, we are calling out for loss and damage finance. There ought to be a progress on loss and damage finance, because without the finances, these communities cannot respond to loss and damages happening right now.
That was Paul Chukwuma from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition speaking to us from Rwanda. Financing for loss and damage is one of the key areas of research of SEI's Zoha Shawoo and Inès Bakthaoui, researchers at SEI. They're launching a new report on operationalizing finance for loss and damage. I spoke to them and first asked Inès what finance there currently is for loss and damage.
So at the moment, most of the finance that exists is either to deal with the immediate response after a climate disaster, and that type of finance is currently provided by humanitarian aid organizations or development organizations. So it's either that or finance to prevent disasters. So that's related to adaptation work done by practitioners. And that is linked as well to development money and climate finance that goes into projects for early warning systems, insurance, etc. But that kind of funding is not always accessible to the poorest people on the planet, which happen to be often the most vulnerable ones. Recently, there has been a push for finance dedicated specifically to loss and damage that is happening outside the UNFCCC, and a few governments have started to commit bilateral finance labeled specifically as loss and damage. Last year, there was Scotland and the Belgian region of Wallonia that did so, 1 million each. And most recently, Denmark just announced that it will dedicate money for loss and damage, minimizing it, averting it, and addressing it.
At the last UN climate change conference, so at COP26 in Glasgow, the small island developing states and developing countries that are gathered in this negotiating group, G77 plus China, they proposed a new finance facility under the UNFCCC for loss and damage, and that fell through. Why?
So there are two key reasons I can give for that. I think the first is different definitions of what actually counts as loss and damage finance, and where the gap is. So a lot of more developed countries are more convinced that financing for addressing loss and damage could already be covered through existing adaptation efforts. Whereas a lot of developing countries have been arguing that that is not enough, and not enough specifically for sudden onset events such as extreme weather events and like hurricanes and floods and things like that, which are at a magnitude that are often impossible to adapt to and that require quick support for recovery and rehabilitation. And so a more developed countries are convinced that you can go through existing channels that are already there, that could be retrofitted or enhanced for providing finance for loss and damage, whereas a lot of developing countries propose this idea of a facility because they feel that those existing structures are not enough and are not suitable for addressing the full spectrum of losses and damages, including, for example, non-economic losses and damages, such as the loss of culture and heritage. The second reason is because there are some fears from developed countries that accepting the idea of a finance facility for loss and damage could open them up to compensation and liability claims, and that they would then be stuck paying huge amounts of finance for all the damages that are occurring in different countries if they commit to something like a facility.
Now, your research investigates how finance for loss and damage can be operationalized. How?
Yes, so climate finance is something that's been going on for a while. We can maybe date it back to the 90s when the Green Environment Facility was started, and then there was adaptation finance through the Adaptation Fund, and now we have the Green Climate Fund. So there is definitely a lot to learn, both positive and negative, from those past and ongoing experiences. What characterizes those funds, I'd say, is that they're not doing a great job at respecting climate justice principles, in the sense that they pretty much copy what development aid has been doing. They tend to favor the priorities of donors, and the least um, power or influence a donor has, the lower the amount of money it will provide. So one of the characteristics of those funds that doesn't really work for loss and damage is a project-based model. Those funds, they like receiving a project and then granting it money and have control over where that money is going, what it is going to be used for, and have an oversight. The issue is that this model takes a lot of time until the implementation, the beginning of implementation of those projects. And that is not appropriate for loss and damage, where, for instance, there's an emergency situation, there's a hurricane that happened somewhere. And what people need on the ground is just rapid money reaching the right people at the right time. So that's an example when projects can be irrelevant.
You mentioned how the existing funds do their work not specifically based on principles like climate justice. Your work suggests that finance for loss and damage should be based on certain principles, should adhere to certain principles. What are these?
So there are a few that I can mention. The first is accessibility. And this is something that Inès was adhering to, is that the current project-based model of financing is not particularly accessible because it is often associated with long proposal forms that developing countries have to fill in to access the finance, very stringent requirements for even getting accredited to accessing money from existing climate finance, and long delays in actually mobilizing that money. And so the idea is for finance for loss and damage to be much more accessible and easily disseminated. And so what we have found from our work is that developing countries themselves could put in a more specific request for finance and develop their own proposal rather than adhering to the very specific requirements of developed countries. They would have the autonomy to shape what financing for loss and damage would look like, what that proposal would look like, in accordance with their needs. The second is this idea of recipient ownership, which is basically that those receiving the money should have autonomy and decision-making power in how it is utilized. And this is not only referring to national governments in different countries, but also local communities and civil society organizations, and particularly vulnerable and marginalized communities that will be facing losses and damages. We're arguing that representatives of these communities should be involved in all levels of decision making in how finance is utilized according to their needs and priorities. And an example of this could include sitting on the boards of different funds at the global level, for example. And another one I can mention is the idea of grant-based and programmatic finance. And so, the question arises, if we're not having project-based finance, what is the alternative? And what we have found is that small grants that are very targeted and local and dedicated to specific grassroots communities, for example, are likely to be more effective than large-scale projects, again, because they would give a lot of autonomy to the communities that would be receiving the money to manage it how they want, to direct it to their priorities and according to their needs. And there would probably be less like reporting requirements and things like that if the money is at a smaller scale and more targeted towards specific kinds of support.
So those are the principles that should be underlying, that should be guiding the operationalization of finance for loss and damage. But what about the mechanism? What about the actual thing through which it flows?
Yeah, so as we said, the challenge is to bring the money from the global level to the local people without alienating them on the ground. And this money is supposed to empower them and make them more resilient. So there are different ways of doing that. And the more traditional option is to go through an intermediary that is very often at the regional level. So, for example, the Caribbean Resilience Bank is one, or at the national level through a given ministry in charge of climate action. What happens often as well is you have, for instance, the UN environmental program that is going to receive the money and then implement projects or distribute that money at a lower level. But there are a lot of stakeholders that could play this middleman role. One of them could be subnational government structures, so city councils, for instance. There are also private or non-for-profit structures such as local funds that have the capacity to receive funding and then distributing it to the right people on the ground because they have this knowledge and expertise. Yeah, so that's another way of doing things. And then it is always helpful to give platforms for these people to have decision power and be able to provide a feedback and even hold accountable those who provide the money. So you would have community committees, local committees that make certain decisions on how much money they need or what they need the money for, and then make that information go up into the system to the middlemen and then to the global funds to inform them in a bottom-up approach on how to use that money.
But at the end of the day, your research also arrives at the conclusion that, yes, there should be a facility specifically dedicated to loss and damage finance under the UNFCCC right away.
So I think we suggest that because of the urgency of addressing finance for loss and damage, and because we are already seeing devastating losses and damages occurring, we argue for a phased approach, which goes for incorporating or increasing finance for loss and damage through existing structures in the short term, but then still not completely taking off the table a loss and damage finance facility, which we suggest should be an end goal in the longer term or in the medium term, and that it should sit under the UNFCCC. If it is not a facility, it could be an equivalent, different type of structure that would fulfill the same purpose. The idea is that it should, whatever the structure is or however finance is mobilized, it should adhere to those principles that we've laid out in order for it to be fair, feasible, and effective.
Can you explain a bit how you arrived at these conclusions? So basically the methods section that would be in your report.
So we first did a literature review of literature on climate justice and climate finance effectiveness, around 55 papers, and we complemented that with some interviews, around 18 for now, with negotiators, with philanthropic funders, local funders, civil society, and humanitarian actors. There are some limitations. We still need to interview more developed country negotiators, and also need to include the voices of community representatives and those who will actually be receiving the finance, as well as representatives of national governments who will potentially be the ones channeling the money from the global to the subnational level. So next year, we're planning to do more focus groups with these different actors to actually explore the different ideas and the options for loss and damage financing that we're suggesting.
Yeah, and next year we're going on the ground with some local partners and helping communities assess their needs for loss and damage. And that will be the occasion to ask them what kind of money they currently have access to, what kind of money they need, and how we can best help them get a hold of that money.
Now, if COP27 was the place for action on loss and damage, as the UN Secretary General has called for that it should be, based on your research, what would that action on loss and damage look like at COP27?
So I think that would look like first a recognition from all stakeholders involved that existing structures are not working and are not fit for purpose for addressing the full spectrum of losses and damages. And secondly, a commitment to mobilize finance for loss and damage that is additional to existing finance for mitigation, adaptation, development assistance, and humanitarian aid. And what that could look like could be a loss and damage finance facility, or any other equivalent structure that is specifically targeted to addressing loss and damage finance, but is still aligned with some of the principles that we outlined.
Thank you, Inès Bakthaoui and Zoha Shawoo. Their new report, Operationalizing Finance for Loss and Damage from Principles to Modalities, is launched on the 1st of November. And that's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To learn more about SEI and to access more resources and materials, head over to sei.org and follow us on Twitter @SEI Research. Let's connect on the next episode. Thanks for listening.